When a winter storm struck the coast of Maine, Ethan Walker returned to the frozen island his family once called worthless. But his grandfather's old German shepherd, Scout, knew better. Beneath the crumbling house and the roar of the Atlantic lay a secret the world was never meant to find. A hidden watch station built to listen to the heartbeat of the sea itself. What began as a lonely man's inheritance would ignite a storm of betrayal, redemption, and the bond between a warrior and the only friend who never stopped standing guard. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of loyalty, courage, and the miracles that rise from the quiet places of the world. The snow outside Manhattan's Sterling and Associates building fell in slow, deliberate flakes, drifting like ash in a gray sky. Inside, the air was warm but suffocating, heavy with the scent of lemon polish, old books, and the kind of money that had forgotten its own value. Ethan Walker sat in a high-backed leather chair, posture straight, hands still, like a soldier waiting for orders that would never come. He was 35, tall and lean, his face carved with quiet endurance. The faint streaks of silver at his temples made him look older than his years, while his blue-gray eyes, sharp, weary, and unblinking, carried the fatigue of someone who had seen too much and spoken too little. A former Navy SEAL, Ethan was a man trained to disappear, to survive, and to endure silence. Yet at this moment, in the still air of the law office, silence felt heavier than any battlefield. Across from him, Mr. Sterling, the family lawyer, adjusted his spectacles with hands thin as bird bones. His face was a map of dry wrinkles and professionalism, his voice a measured rasp, precise and lifeless, as though he'd been practicing detachment for 40 years. "We are gathered for the reading of the last will and testament of Mr. Julian Croft," he began. The old man's name hung in the air, and for a heartbeat, Ethan's jaw tightened. Julian Croft, his grandfather, had been a ghost for most of Ethan's life, a man remembered only through the smell of engine oil, salt, and cigar smoke. In the corner sat Ryan Hale, Ethan's cousin, 5 years younger, but looking softer, rounder, and infinitely more pleased with himself. Ryan's black hair was slicked back with expensive pomade. His tailored navy suit stretched a little too tight around his midsection. He smiled the way wealthy men do when they know the game is already won. "Let's get this over with," he muttered, drumming manicured fingers against the polished desk. Ryan had always been the golden boy, the heir apparent, charming at parties, ruthless in boardrooms, and as shallow as the champagne he drank. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat and began to read. The rhythm of his voice matched the ticking of the old wall clock, steady, relentless. The Croft family fortune, vast and meticulously built, flowed neatly into Ryan's name. The shipping company shares, the Manhattan apartment, the Hamptons summer house. Each sentence landed like a hammer, deliberate and final. Ethan sat motionless, watching the smirk spread across his cousin's face. "And finally," the lawyer continued, "to my grandson, Ethan Walker, I leave my property at Seawolf Point, off the coast of Maine, and everything upon it, along with the care of my loyal companion, Scout." Ethan blinked. Ryan's laugh broke the silence like a bottle against a dock. "A pile of rock and an old dog?" he sneered. "Guess the old man finally lost his mind." Mr. Sterling's eyes, pale and oddly sympathetic, flicked toward Ethan. "Your grandfather added a personal note," he said quietly, unfolding a smaller page. This bequest is made with the understanding that Ethan, and only Ethan, knows the value of a silent watch. The words struck Ethan like a sudden wind from the sea, sharp, cold, and full of something he couldn't name. The value of a silent watch. It was a phrase out of another life, the kind whispered between soldiers during endless night watches. His heart gave a single heavy beat. Ryan rose, snapping his briefcase shut. "Enjoy your rock, soldier boy," he said, voice dripping contempt. "Maybe you can train the dog to salute." He left in a waft of expensive cologne and derision. When the door shut, the room seemed to exhale. Mr. Sterling leaned back, studying Ethan. "Julian Croft was deliberate," he said softly. "He didn't do anything without reason." He handed over a folder, a hand-drawn map of the Maine coastline, a deed, and a note written in a tight, mechanical script. "There's a man named Jed at Port Clyde. He's been paid to take care of the property's supplies, and the dog. Julian wanted you to have this personally." Ethan stared at the folder. The edges were worn, like something often handled but never opened. He took it, the paper cool against his skin. "Thank you," he said simply, rising to leave. The lawyer nodded once, an old man's blessing wrapped in silence. 2 days later, Ethan drove north through a landscape that grew lonelier with every mile. The city's noise fell away behind him, replaced by the rhythmic hum of tires over frozen asphalt and the distant cry of gulls. By the time he reached the harbor town of Port Clyde, dusk had fallen, turning the world into shades of iron and smoke. The air smelled of salt and pine, honest and raw. A man was mending a fishing net beneath the yellow glow of a single dock light. His name was Jed, weathered and stoic, his beard streaked with white and his eyes as pale as sea glass. He looked up as Ethan approached, his voice deep and unhurried. "You must be the Croft boy." "Ethan Walker," Ethan replied, extending a gloved hand. Jed shook it firmly, his calloused grip strong. "Your grandfather was a good man," Jed said. "Kept to himself, but he was fair. The dog's waiting on the boat." Tied to the dock was a small motorboat, its paint chipped and its hull scarred. And there, sitting in the stern as still as a statue, was Scout, a German shepherd with thick silver gray and white fur, the color of sea foam in winter light. His ears were high, his gaze steady, amber eyes fixed on Ethan with uncanny intelligence. Ethan crouched, lowering himself to the dog's level. "Hey, Scout," he murmured. The dog sniffed the air, studying him, tail unmoving, until finally it gave one slow, deliberate wag. For the first time in months, Ethan felt something inside him ease, a quiet connection in the cold. Jed nodded toward the horizon, where the sea met the clouds in one endless gray. "Seawolf Point's waiting," he said. "Hard place to live, but maybe that's why he left it to you." Ethan looked at the island barely visible in the storm haze, a jagged tooth of stone against the Atlantic. His breath misted in the freezing air. "Maybe," he said softly. "Or maybe it's where I finally learn what silence is worth." Snow blanketed Seawolf Point in a silence so complete it felt sacred. The wind moved across the Atlantic in slow, mournful sighs, sweeping drifts of white against the weathered cabin perched on the cliff's edge. Inside, Ethan Walker worked by the pale light of dawn leaking through frost-covered windows. His breath rose in faint clouds as he hammered a loose plank into place. The old boards complained beneath every strike, as though the house itself resented being disturbed after years of neglect. Ethan paused, exhaled, and rubbed the scar that traced a pale line from his right temple to his jaw. A memory flickered. The chaos of sand and fire, the metallic taste of adrenaline, the sound of a friend's last breath. He closed his eyes until it passed. Here the war felt distant, but its ghosts never truly left. He had hoped this island, cold and forgotten, would strip them from him. The cabin was smaller than he expected. A single room with a sleeping cot, a table scarred by time, a rusted stove, and the great stone hearth that dominated one wall. The scent of salt and damp wood lingered in everything, but Ethan had known worse places. He rebuilt the porch with salvaged planks, sealed the windows with tar, and stacked driftwood by the fireplace. The rhythm of labor was medicine. Work until sweat met cold air, until the past had no room to breathe. Scout moved silently behind him, a constant shadow. The dog was magnificent. 5 years old, thick silver gray and white fur, the color of breaking waves. His amber eyes gleamed with uncanny intelligence, scanning the world as though everything required guarding. When Ethan first arrived, Scout had been distant, polite but watchful. Now, the German shepherd followed him everywhere. To the edge of the cliff at sunrise, along the jagged path to the tide pools, even when Ethan gathered kindling in the snow. It was as if the animal had appointed himself guardian of both man and island. One afternoon, while the wind scraped the shutters and the sea roared below, Ethan found himself talking aloud. "You ever get tired of this, boy?" His voice echoed off the bare walls. Scout tilted his head, ears pricked, then padded over to rest his muzzle against Ethan's knee. It wasn't an answer, but somehow it felt like one. Ethan smiled, a rare, uncertain curve of his mouth, and scratched the fur behind the dog's ear. "Yeah," he murmured. "Me too." Nights were hardest. The cold seeped through every crack in the walls, and the memories came crawling back. He dreamed of desert winds, the thud of rotors, the sudden silence that followed explosions. In the worst dreams, he woke gasping, fingers clenching the blanket like a rifle stock. Each time, Scout was there, sitting at the foot of the cot, eyes gleaming in the dim light, a steady breath anchoring him to the present. "You're a better soldier than I ever was," Ethan once whispered, his voice rough. Scout thumped his tail once, then settled his head on his paws, as if to say, "We're still standing." As days folded into weeks, Ethan's hands grew accustomed to the island's rhythm. He learned the groan each floorboard made, the whistling draft through the north wall, the way the sea changed color before a storm. He fished from the rocks, patched leaks in the roof, and cut narrow trails through the snow. The solitude was harsh but healing. For the first time in years, his mind quieted, until that night. The storm came without warning. By dusk, wind screamed through the gaps in the walls, and snow lashed the windows in white fury. Ethan fed the fire, watching the flames lick the soot-darkened stones. Scout lay curled near the hearth, half asleep, his chest rising in slow rhythm. The room glowed in flickering orange light, a fragile refuge against the storm's rage outside. Ethan took comfort in the sound of burning wood, a sound he could control. Then Scout's ears twitched. The dog lifted his head, muscles tensing. A low growl rippled in his throat. Ethan frowned. "What is it?" he asked. Scout stood, nose to the air, sniffing with quick, purposeful breaths. Then, to Ethan's surprise, the dog turned toward the fireplace and began pawing at the hearthstones. "Hey, stop that!" Ethan said, kneeling beside him. The shepherd ignored him, digging harder, claws scraping against stone. His movements weren't frantic. They were deliberate, focused. A deep bark burst from his chest, sharp enough to make Ethan's pulse jump. He pressed a hand to the floor and felt something, a faint vibration, not from the storm, but from below. Ethan fetched his flashlight and ran his fingers along the hearth's edge. The largest stone, blackened by years of fire, had a thin seam running beneath it, a detail he'd never noticed. He wedged the iron poker into the gap and levered upward. The stone shifted with a groan and revealed a small cavity lined with lead. Inside lay a rectangular metal box, tarnished but intact. Scout sat beside him, tail still, eyes locked on the discovery. "You knew," Ethan whispered. The dog gave a single huff, as if confirming it. Ethan pried the box open. Inside were two objects, an old leather-bound journal wrapped in oilcloth, and a brass T-shaped key, smooth with age. He ran his thumb along the journal's edge, the paper brittle and faintly smelling of salt. The first page bore neat handwriting in black ink, letters sharp, almost mechanical. Julian Croft, Naval Acoustic Division, 1973. Ethan read further, his pulse quickening. Diagrams of sound waves filled the pages, notes on pressure, density, and resonance. Phrases leapt out. Submarine communication field, natural amplifier, frequency beyond human hearing. His grandfather hadn't been a recluse. He'd been an engineer, a scientist. The journal described how Seawolf Point wasn't just a remote rock. It was a geological anomaly, a perfect sound lens, amplifying the whispers of the ocean floor. Julian had built instruments to study it, calling it the Song of the Deep. Ethan sat back, the storm forgotten. The flames crackled beside him, casting shifting shadows across the walls. He turned the brass key in his hand, its cold weight grounding him in the moment. Scout pressed closer, resting his head against Ethan's arm. The man stared into the fire, the reflection of gold dancing in his tired eyes. Somewhere between the roar of the sea and the dog's steady breath, he felt something stir. Not fear, but purpose. Maybe the old man hadn't left him a burden after all. Maybe this island wasn't punishment, but an inheritance of silence, and of secrets waiting beneath it. The morning tide withdrew under a pale, steel-gray sky, and the air bit like broken glass. Ethan Walker stood at the edge of Seawolf Point, wind carving lines of frost across his face. The world around him was stripped bare, the ocean drawn back to reveal its hidden bones. He held his grandfather's brass key in one gloved hand, the metal cold enough to sting. Every instinct from his years as a Navy SEAL warned him this was madness, climbing down slick rock faces with only a dog and a dead man's map. Yet there was something deeper than instinct guiding him now, something like faith. Scout trotted ahead, a blur of silver-gray fur against black stone. The German shepherd's ears were pricked, his movements precise and deliberate. The dog's nose twitched, reading the invisible script of salt, algae, and time. Ethan followed, his boots crunching over frozen seaweed and barnacle-coated rock. "Easy, boy," he murmured. His breath came out in white clouds that vanished instantly. For days he had studied the cipher in Julian Croft's journal, a tangle of numbers and nautical symbols that finally made sense in one line. Where the sea kneels, the door listens. It had led him here to the Trident Rocks, three jagged prongs of granite clawing toward the Atlantic sky. He crouched at the base of the middle spire. The tide was so low that the rocks glistened with green and brown seaweed, slick and heavy. Scout moved close, sniffing at the wet stone. Ethan could feel the animal's pulse of attention, a living radar sweeping the dark. "You smell something?" he asked quietly. The dog didn't answer. He never did. But he stepped forward and began scraping at the rock with one paw. Ethan leaned in, flashlight trembling in his hand. Beneath the curtain of algae was something unnatural, a faint circle carved into the granite, perfectly smooth. He wiped away the slime with his sleeve. The pattern was unmistakable, an intricate gear-shaped indentation, the same as the drawing in his grandfather's notes. "Good boy," Ethan whispered. Scout gave a low rumble, half growl, half approval, then sat back as Ethan fitted the brass key into the slot. It slid in perfectly. When he turned it, a vibration passed through the stone, deep, resonant, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. The granite groaned, echoing across the cove. Seawater slithered out from the seams as a rectangular section of rock began to shift inward. For a moment, Ethan thought it was collapsing, but then the stone receded smoothly, revealing a tunnel beyond. Black, square, and impossibly straight. Cold air rushed out, dry and sterile, carrying the faint scent of metal and ozone. Ethan's breath caught. The seal in him cataloged every detail automatically: angle of entry, potential traps, oxygen flow. But the part of him that was Julian Croft's grandson only felt awe. "This is it," he murmured. Scout pressed against his leg, his body taut but fearless. "Stay close," Ethan said, stepping forward. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, glinting off smooth metallic walls. The tunnel extended 50 feet into the cliff, perfectly level, as though drilled by the hand of a god. The silence was absolute, the kind that makes your heartbeat sound too loud. At the tunnel's end stood a heavy circular door with a wheel lock in the center, the type used in submarines. Ethan gripped it and turned. The wheel spun freely, smooth despite decades of neglect, and the door swung inward with a soft hiss. They entered a cavernous chamber. Ethan stopped, stunned. The place looked like something between a military control room and a cathedral. The walls were carved from the living granite of the island, reinforced with steel ribs that gleamed faintly under a network of dormant lights. Rows of old consoles lined one side, covered in switches and levers. Against the far wall stretched a massive curved screen, dark and lifeless. The air was clean, dry, preserved. Time itself had been locked out. Scout padded forward, claws clicking on metal grates. He sniffed the air, then sat by Ethan's side, waiting. The dog seemed small in the vastness of the room, but his steady breathing grounded the man. Ethan felt something he hadn't felt since his service days, the electric hum of purpose. He found the main control console and opened his grandfather's journal again. The last pages were written in the same precise mechanical hand. Activate the tidal regulators first, then bring the acoustic array online. Julian Croft had thought of everything, even left a startup sequence like a gift. Ethan followed it step by step, pulling heavy levers that moaned in protest, switching on ancient circuits. Somewhere deep in the rock, machinery awoke. The floor trembled faintly as power surged through buried cables. One by one, green indicators flickered to life on the panels. the air filled with a low hum, the sound of something vast and old remembering itself. When he pressed the final button, the curved screen shuddered, lines of text flashing briefly before melting into motion. What appeared next stole Ethan's breath. The black void filled with color, waves of blue and gold and violet swirling like auroras underwater. He realized, with a rush of wonder, that he was seeing the ocean in sound. Whales sang as rippling bands of light. The pulse of distant currents appeared as slow-moving rivers of color. Even the tectonic murmurs of the earth glowed faintly at the edges. He whispered, "The song of the deep." His grandfather's words echoed in his mind, to listen, not to command. Scout stood beside him, eyes reflecting the dancing colors, ears twitching as if he could hear it too. For the first time in years, Ethan felt at peace. He wasn't a soldier or a wanderer anymore. He was a listener, a guardian of something far older than war. Then his eyes caught a faint glint below the main screen, Sasao, small brass plaque polished to a mirror shine. He knelt and read the inscription. "Use it to protect, not to profit. The watch is now yours." The words burned into him. This wasn't inheritance. It was command and responsibility. He glanced down at Scout. "Looks like we've got work to do, partner." The dog gave a single quiet bark, as if accepting the mission. Outside, the tide began to return, swallowing their footprints, hiding the doorway once more. Above the waves, Seawolf Point stood silent against the winter sky. But deep within its heart, the old station thrummed again, alive under the guardianship of a man who had finally found his purpose. The Atlantic sky bruised purple long before the first wave struck. The wind carried a metallic taste, sharp and foreboding, like the breath before lightning. On Seawolf Point, the ocean rumbled with the voice of something ancient and alive, and Ethan Walker felt it in his bones. The island was warning him. He stood near the cabin, the rebuilt porch trembling beneath his boots. His gray tactical jacket was soaked through, his breath visible in the freezing air. Scout, the German shepherd at his side, paced restlessly, his thick silver-gray fur bristling against the wind, ears pricked toward the horizon. "You feel it too," Ethan murmured, his blue-gray eyes narrowing. He had spent years reading the sea, the sky, and silence itself. This wasn't a storm. It was a siege. Miles away, beneath the safety of city towers, Ryan Hale poured himself another glass of whiskey and stared at the ledger open on his marble desk. The numbers didn't lie. Millions of dollars had been funneled into something on that frozen island. Ryan was 30, handsome in a manufactured way. Smooth cheeks, dark hair combed with precision, eyes too sharp for sincerity. His expensive navy suit fit like armor, yet no amount of tailoring could hide the weight of greed that hunched his posture. "So the old man wasn't crazy," he muttered. He hid it there. When his accountant hesitated, Ryan's smile thinned. "We're not talking about a shack. We're talking about technology. Something he didn't want anyone else to find." The accountant, a timid man with nervous hands, swallowed hard. "Mr. Hale, the weather reports are irrelevant," Ryan snapped. He leaned forward, his tone honeyed and lethal. "Find me a boat, and 2 men who don't ask questions." By nightfall, a sleek white motor yacht cut through the storm-thickened waters of Maine, its engines whining like a predator's snarl. The crew consisted of Rook, a giant of a man with shoulders like a wall, and Finn, thin and twitchy, his blonde hair plastered to his forehead, eyes darting like a trapped animal's. Rook had the build of a brawler, shaved head, broken nose, and a scar across his jaw that looked earned, not accidental. He said little, his silence born not from thought, but from habit. Finn was his opposite, constantly talking, hands fidgeting, every laugh sounding like an apology. Ryan despised both, but needed them. "Get me to that island," he ordered over the roar of the wind. When Seawolf Point appeared through the sleet, it looked less like land and more like a beast rising from the sea. The cabin stood dimly lit, snow clinging to its roof like ash. Ryan's pulse quickened. The treasure, whatever form it took, was within reach. On the island, Scout's growl cut through the wind. Ethan turned, spotting the unnatural gleam of a white hull forcing its way through the storm. His stomach tightened. "Visitors," he said grimly. The German shepherd lowered his stance, every muscle ready. When the yacht's smaller dinghy touched the rocky shore, 3 figures emerged, drenched and staggering through the surf. Ryan was first, his expensive coat clinging to him like a curse. "Ethan!" he shouted over the wind, forcing a grin that never reached his eyes. "You've been hard to reach." Ethan didn't move. He stood firm in the snow, the storm whipping around him. "Turn back. The weather's turning violent. You won't make it off the water once the tide shifts." Ryan laughed, but his voice trembled. "Oh, I think I'll take my chances. I came for what's mine." "What you think is yours," Ethan corrected, his tone calm but sharp as broken ice. Scout's growl deepened, a low thunder that made Finn flinch. Rook stepped forward, a mountain of muscle in a soaked leather jacket. "We can do this easy," he said, his voice low and hoarse. "Or not." Ethan studied them. The arrogance in Ryan's smirk, the greed in his eyes, and felt a cold sadness settle in his chest. He had seen this look before. Men blinded by what they wanted, walking into their own graves. "There's nothing up here for you," he said. "Go back." Ryan's smile widened, brittle as glass. "Then show me the basement." The first flash of lightning split the horizon. The storm roared to life, waves crashing against the cliffs with the sound of detonations. Ethan turned toward the cabin just as Scout began to bark, sharp and urgent. The German shepherd darted to the porch, then back toward Ethan, barking again. The same warning tone he'd used once before, the night they found the hidden journal. Ethan's instincts flared. "Inside, now!" he shouted. They barely made it through the door when the gale struck full force. The roof groaned under the weight of wind and snow. Scout ran to the hearth, pawing at it furiously. Ethan knew. "The tunnel," he muttered. He turned to the others. "If you want to live, follow the dog." Ryan hesitated, eyes flicking between his cousin and the shuddering walls. "You're bluffing!" A thunderclap answered for Ethan. The window shattered inward, spraying glass and seawater across the floor. Finn screamed. Rook grabbed Ryan by the arm, shoving him forward. "Move!" Ethan pulled the heavy stone slab from the hearth's base, revealing the narrow opening below. Scout leapt first, vanishing into the dark passage. Ethan went next, the freezing air biting his skin as he dropped into the narrow shaft. Behind him, the others followed, fear finally stronger than pride. As Ethan pulled the stone cover back into place, the cabin's roof tore open with a wrenching crack. They descended into silence. The only sound was their ragged breathing and the distant growl of the sea. At the end of the passage, Ethan unlocked the reinforced hatch leading to the underground chamber. The hum of machinery greeted them. The heart of Julian Croft's legacy, still alive, still listening. Ryan stared, wide-eyed, as green and gold lights flickered across the consoles. "What is this?" he whispered. Ethan ignored him, moving to the main terminal. Scout stood alert beside him, his fur damp and glistening under the sterile light. The sonar screen pulsed with shifting colors, but something was wrong. Among the rhythmic patterns of ocean sound, a dark blue shape appeared, moving steadily toward the island. Ethan's blood ran cold. "It's a sub," he said under his breath. The screen labeled it automatically. Unknown vessel, approaching depth, 90 meters. Ryan's face drained of color. "That's them," he stammered. "The investors. They were supposed to sell it," Ethan finished for him, disgust sharpening his voice. "You brought them here." Scout growled, low and dangerous. The console lights reflected in his amber eyes like fire. Ethan's hands moved across the keyboard, typing an old military cipher. He paused only once, his expression set in iron. "Hostile submersible detected," he said quietly, then sent the message. "The silent watch is under threat." The transmission light blinked once. Sent. Outside, the storm howled with the fury of the ocean itself, and beneath it, something mechanical and hungry moved closer. Ethan looked at Scout, the one creature he still trusted. "Looks like we're not alone anymore, partner." The storm ended as abruptly as it had begun. Dawn broke over the Atlantic like a breath held too long, a pale sun bleeding through torn clouds, painting the sea in silver and ash. Ethan Walker stood inside the underground chamber, the low hum of the sonar still vibrating in his chest. Around him, silence returned, the kind of silence that carries memory. Scout lay near his boots, his fur still damp, amber eyes fixed on the screen that pulsed faintly with light. The ocean had calmed, but Ethan knew calm was just another kind of tension. Then, across the sonar's black field, new signals bloomed. Streaks of gold cutting through the darkness. U.S. Coast Guard. Relief and disbelief collided in him at once. "They heard us," he whispered. Above, the sea was chaos incarnate. From the shattered cliffs of Seawolf Point, the once sturdy cabin had vanished, torn clean from its foundation by the nor'easter. All that remained were twisted planks embedded in frozen stone. Ryan Hale stood near the chamber's railing, drenched and shaking, his slick hair clinging to his pale forehead. Gone was the smug businessman. What remained was a man stripped of delusion. His expensive coat hung in tatters, eyes sunken with terror and exhaustion. You called them?" he stammered. Ethan didn't answer. The sonar screen showed the hostile sub's blue signal now cornered by two golden ones. Swift, deliberate, merciless. Seconds later, it vanished entirely, swallowed by the black. Ethan closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. It's over. Behind him, Rook and Finn huddled together in the far corner, pale and wordless. Rook, the mountain of muscle who once followed violence like a creed, now looked small, eyes glassy, hands trembling as if realizing for the first time the cost of loyalty to the wrong man. Finn's lips moved in silent prayer, tears cutting lines through the salt and grime on his face. Neither dared to meet Ethan's eyes. Scout lifted his head and gave a soft whine, sensing the shift. Ethan knelt beside him, running his hand over the dog's neck. Good boy, he murmured. The shepherd's fur shimmered like smoke and snow in the dim light. For a moment, the man and the dog shared a stillness so complete it seemed to quiet even the hum of the machines. Hours later, the grinding sound of the surface hatch broke the silence. When Ethan climbed up the narrow tunnel and pushed open the stone seal, the blinding light of morning hit him like absolution. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world scoured clean. The cliffs were raw, the sea fierce but steady again. A gray naval cutter floated in the cove, its deck crew already lowering a small boat. The rescue was quick and efficient. Armed sailors fanned out, scanning the ledge with wary eyes. Ethan raised his hands instinctively, but the lead officer, a woman in her 30s with a calm, commanding presence, shook her head. "We're not here for you," she said. Her name patch read Lieutenant Ramirez. Her dark hair was tied back tightly, her uniform immaculate even in the aftermath of a storm. "We picked up your distress signal. Admiral Hayes is en route." Ryan, pale and defeated, tried to speak. "I didn't mean—" Ramirez cut him off with a look colder than the wind. "You'll have time to explain everything, Mr. Hale, to federal agents." Two sailors stepped forward, cuffing him without ceremony. As they led him to the boat, Ryan's voice cracked. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. I just wanted—" Ethan turned away. "Yeah," he said softly. "So did we all." When Admiral Hayes arrived an hour later, the world was quiet again. He stepped off the cutter with the posture of a man who had seen too many storms, both weather and war. Hayes was in his late 60s, tall and broad-shouldered, his uniform neat but worn at the edges. His face was lined like folded maps, his gray eyes steady and kind beneath the brim of his cap. The kind of man who carried both authority and sorrow in equal measure. He approached Ethan without preamble, his boots crunching over the frost. "You're Julian Croft's grandson," he said, his voice a low rumble. Ethan nodded. The Admiral's gaze drifted toward the sea. "I served with your grandfather once. Smartest man I ever met. Stubborn, too. He used to say the ocean doesn't belong to anyone. We're just guests in its house." Ethan smiled faintly. Sounds like him. Hayes studied him for a long moment. "Julian always believed you'd come here one day. He said you were the only one who could understand what the silent watch really meant." He paused, his breath fogging in the cold air. "Now it's yours to continue. The Navy wants to rebuild the station, properly this time. Secure, stormproof, and under your oversight. We'd like you to stay on as civilian operator." Ethan hesitated. Years of combat, loss, and silence had made him cautious with hope. "Why me?" Hayes smiled, faintly but sincerely. "Because your grandfather trusted you, and because you answered the call when no one else could." For the first time in years, Ethan felt something shift inside him. Not duty, not burden, but belonging. He looked down at Scout, who sat poised beside him, tail brushing the snow. The dog's amber eyes met his, steady and knowing. "Looks like we've still got work to do, partner," Ethan said quietly. A month later, the new observation post stood where the cabin once had. Reinforced steel and tempered glass replaced the splintered wood, built to withstand the fury of 100 nor'easters. Inside, the consoles gleamed anew, powered by both tide and faith. Ethan stood on the cliff's edge in his gray navy jacket, wind whipping through his short brown hair, the ocean stretching endless before him. Scout sat close, his fur glowing gold in the dying light. Together they watched the horizon where sky met sea, the same horizon his grandfather once guarded. "The watch is yours now," Hayes had said, and Ethan had accepted. As twilight deepened, the sound of the waves rose like slow applause. Ethan placed a gloved hand on Scout's head. "Not all legacies are made of gold," he whispered. "Sometimes they're made of trust and the eyes that never look away." Scout gave a soft bark, as if agreeing. The wind carried the sound out to sea, a promise kept between man, dog, and the endless, listening deep. As the sea settled beneath the crimson horizon, Ethan lifted his gaze toward the endless sky. The wind carried a sound softer than any tide, a whisper that felt like grace. In that quiet, he finally understood what his grandfather had meant by the silent watch. It wasn't about guarding a secret buried in stone or steel. It was about faith, the quiet kind that keeps a man standing when the world collapses around him. Sometimes, God doesn't send miracles with thunder or fire. Sometimes, He sends them in fur and loyalty, in the warm breath of a dog who refuses to leave your side, or the still small voice that reminds you to hold on when you think you can't. Ethan had lost his battles, his brothers, and his peace, but on that desolate island, through one faithful companion, God gave him purpose again. And perhaps that's what the ocean had been saying all along. That even in the coldest silence, love still speaks, faith still echoes, and no soul is truly forgotten. If you believe miracles still walk beside us, sometimes on four paws, share this story with someone who needs hope tonight. Leave a comment about where you're watching from, and tell us what you're grateful for. Don't forget to subscribe, so together we can keep these stories of faith, courage, and compassion alive. May God bless you, keep your watch steady, and remind you, you are never truly alone.